Okay, we need to be concerned about that. How do we negotiate, or how do we navigate our anxiety? A lot of the stuff is stuff that we go, wait a second. Not only is being anxious something I need to pay attention to, but why am I anxious about that?
Parents, it's time to celebrate. The new On Purpose Parents podcast, a Saddleback Parents podcast, has arrived, and we're here to help you win at parenting. As parents ourselves, we know that parenting is the toughest, most important job on the planet. You can't possibly do it alone. And now you don't have to, because we're your people. Connect with us by texting the word parents to the number 83000, visiting us at onpurposeparents.com, and tuning in every Wednesday with Kurt, Grace, and Chris for tips, ideas, and encouragement to help you win at being an on-purpose parent.
That music sounds like a sitcom.
Yeah.
It sounds like I'm about to watch The Jeffersons or something.
I know.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my goodness, DJ voice coming in.
How about this one? Here, pull that. Oh, gosh.
Chris is out of control.
I'm afraid to
Oh,
talk.
Chris. Okay, producer Chris. Slow it down, buddy. Slow it down.
Producer Chris is having so much fun this morning.
Somebody take that cheesy little soundboard
Someone had a
away
lot of
from
coffee
him.
this morning.
That's like a $100 soundboard from Walmart, and
amazing.
somehow he's turned it into DJ Chris over there. We apologize, people listening.
They're like, what is going on here?
I don't know what our brand is, but that is off-brand. Whatever our brand
We
is,
can make it our brand.
No, please, we can't. I like having fun as much as the next guy. I'm not quite sure what happened there. You okay,
man.
Producer Chris? You all right today?
Yeah, I'm much better now.
Okay. I'm glad you got that out of your system. I pray you got that out of your system. Whew, okay. Well, that's a weird intro to a serious conversation we're going to have today.
Yes.
So today we kind of call these one-hit wonders, where really what we do is we look at the questions that have been submitted. Our last episode, if you're listening or watching in a linear fashion, sequentially, last episode was our official Q&A episode. And what we kind of have found ourselves doing is we'll oftentimes have like 4 questions, and then one of them we say, ooh, that one's big enough that it needs more than a 4-minute conversation. We might want to dedicate a whole show to that. And so that's what we did today is we peeled off one of the questions that we got submitted and said, let's not lump that in with the other 3, which were great questions last episode, but let's tackle this one separately and give it a little bit more attention. And today's question, Grace, is one that just in our sort of side conversations, you've got some thoughts about, some experience with, and me not quite so much. Partly, I think, I'm saying all this before we even read the question, but partly because we're different generations and how we were even raised to talk about some of our struggles or some of our feelings. So on the one hand, I go, well, I've never experienced that. A more accurate statement might be, I've probably totally experienced it. I've just never known how to express it or how to identify it, because I don't think I was raised in a generation where we allowed ourselves to really acknowledge some of those feelings and struggles. So I just don't have as much input, I think, as you do. So today we're going to kind of let you run point, and I'll chime in here or there. But today is really the Grace Yoon show, ladies and gentlemen. Wisdom from Grace.
Is that why we had all that music at the beginning?
Apparently. So Chris, why don't you read the question and then we'll jump into it.
Yeah, so this question came in through parents@saddleback.com. And the question is, how do I get over this crippling anxiety of parenthood? Will this anxiety ever pass, and am I alone in this feeling?
Oh, boy. Well, we want to say to the parent that sent that in, first of all, thank you so much for writing in. Like we always say, we want to be a community of parents, not just a one-way conversation, but we want to hear from you all, not just your questions, but we may be saying certain things during an episode that you have some input and some advice or suggestions that we can share with parents as well. So we really appreciate that question. And man, oh man, anxiety and parenthood. First of all, I'll say you are not alone.
Right.
It is something that almost, if you talk to any parent, whether we're able to fully identify or express it or not, it is something we are all struggling with and facing. And so we do want to share some thoughts and some advice or suggestions this morning. But before we do want to preface that we're not mental health professionals. Kurt says this all the time. We're not professionals. We're just parents sharing our stories, sharing our thoughts. So if it is something more intense or more severe, we definitely encourage you to seek professional help or counseling. And for this morning, we're just happy to share some of our own thoughts and experiences on the matter.
That's good. Good.
Yeah, so I don't know about this being the whole Grace Yoon show, because Kurt and Chris, I know, will have really good insights as well. But I did have 3 steps. When you are a parent and you're facing this feeling of anxiety that seems overwhelming and won't leave you alone, what are just some 3 practical steps or ways of thinking and action that you can do to help break that cycle a little bit and maybe get you on a path that's more positive and more productive? And so my first step is an awareness question you could ask yourself if you are chasing fool's gold. Let me explain what that means. What I mean by fool's gold. So my kids listen to these stories, audio stories done by this company called Your Story Hour. They are great, by the way, if any parent wants to check them out. They have MP3s on file, and they tell like fiction stories, biography stories, biblical stories. I actually listened to it when I was younger. That company was still around on like cassette tapes. And I had saved them and got my kids listening to them when they were younger, because I saved them throughout my entire life. But now there's a website and they sell them on MP3. So anyway, so there's a story, and it's about these 2 boys that one of the boys was peer pressuring the other guy to go into this mining cave because he found gold. And long story short, the kid was like, oh, I don't know, I shouldn't do this. We shouldn't trespass, all this stuff. But he goes anyway. Things turn out disastrous. They get hurt. All the parents find out. The neighbor finds out. The person who owns that mining cave. And at the end of the day, it all turned out that the thing that they were chasing after that caused all this chaos and ruckus, it wasn't even real gold. It was something really shiny, really attractive, but it was fool's gold. And we know the rock that's fool's gold, that's all shiny and things like that. And for me, that's a really great illustration that in the same way, sometimes when we get stuck in these anxious thoughts for our kids, it can be like chasing so hard after a treasure that ultimately is so worthless, and it leaves you with nothing of good value. And to me, it's like when I've experienced this, it's like our anxious thoughts may be also revealing in us this longing for control deep in our hearts that might be turning into an idol. And when I say idol, it just means something we obsess over, something we pine after, something we need to have. And this hyper focus on control when it comes to our kids, it's totally understandable because we want to protect our kids. We want them to be safe. We want them to be okay. But when we try to have control over things that we just can't, it's ultimately so toxic for our souls, and it leaves us with nothing of good value. Yeah. It's like fool's gold. And so I think the first step is asking, when I'm having these anxious thoughts, am I chasing, just to first stop yourself and say, am I chasing after fool's gold? What am I doing? Is it actually resulting in something of value?
Right.
Or am I just spinning in circles? And ultimately, from where I started to where I ended, am I no better off with nothing of value?
Right. And another way to think of fool's gold is sometimes we get anxious or we have anxiety over things that don't matter, right? So we might be very anxious over is our daughter going to get a B or a C in math class? Right. So we go to the spinning, it's not productive, but ultimately even the item that we're anxious about is fool's gold, because at the end of the day, a B or a C for your 7th grade daughter in math class is fool's gold. It doesn't matter. It's not going to affect their long-term health, wealth, happiness, any of the above.
Yeah.
So that might be also too, is like, what you're, because some stuff that we get anxious about is very important. Now, should we be anxious about it? That's different, right? But the item that's causing the anxiety is an important item. Okay, we need to be concerned about that. How do we negotiate, or how do we navigate our anxiety? A lot of the stuff is stuff that we go, wait a second. Not only is being anxious something I need to pay attention to, but why am I anxious about that when it's really just fool's gold?
That's a great question. Yeah. So that first step to me is really like an awareness thing, and it's just a check. It's the first step, because sometimes when we get in these anxious thoughts, we can't even have those questions like, does it really matter or not? We're just in the habit, that's just how we way that we live life as parents. So that first question really is to check yourself. First, are you chasing fool's gold? The step 2 that I have is, now that you are aware of this, like maybe you're in a situation where you might be chasing after fool's gold, is to identify then in that situation what is in your ability to control and what is not. When Karis was about three and a half to 4, and it was Zoe's first birthday party, we had a big birthday party at church. We had, in Korean culture, the first birthday is a really big deal. Like there's different traditions that we do at the party. And so we had a ton of people over, a ton of food. I had these little fruit on these skewer sticks, like grapes, and kids were running around having fun. And at one point, I saw Karis in the middle of the room, and parents were wanting to take a picture, a group of parents, friends. So they were like, Karis, come on over. And she was like, kind of like standing still. And we were like, that's kind of a weird reaction, like instead of just running over to take the picture. And so like we looked more carefully, and she was choking like on food. And so in that moment, like Sam and I run over, and I remember my first instinct though was first to look at the row of parents that were standing, because what I wanted to do was, who knows what to do here? Who looks confident? Because I'm not confident right now. And seconds matter so much when someone's choking. And when I looked, like nobody looked confident. So it's like, okay, I guess it's me. And I'm trying to do the Heimlich. It's not working. So I'm like, Sam. So Sam tries to do the Heimlich. It's not working. At this point, like Karis's lips are like kind of turning blue, and she's struggling. And it's like so terrifying, right? That feeling of adrenaline. And then I was like, oh, my friend Hannah, she's a doctor and she's visiting from out of town. So I just like scream, Hannah. Sam grabs her, runs out. She's outside, and she just sees like, just a bunch of panicked people running towards her. We just like throw her onto her, just, not even clear what we're saying. And she does the Heimlich maneuver once, really hard, and all this fruit comes out, all this fruit that we had in skewers. And for the longest time after that experience, I used to like blog about like my kids and show pictures. When I got to that part of blogging, I stopped blogging because I couldn't think about that situation. Because every time I reflected back on it, it would just put me into, like we said, this loop of what if Hannah wasn't there? What if we couldn't do it? What if she was playing outside? What if she wasn't around people and she just started choking? And you just get into this loop, and it's like so anxious. And I spend hours thinking like that, not even conscious. And in that case, so step 2, I really needed to identify what's in my control and what's not. So using that as an example, one thing that's helped me identify what is in my control is to ask the question, is there actually a tangible, doable action step I can take? And if I can identify an action step, then do it. Go take that action step. There is something very empowering about identifying something you can do and then doing that. So with Karis and that whole choking and not being able to kind of break out of that cycle, an action step I could do is, I could take a class that teaches me better how to do the Heimlich maneuver. That's something I can do. I could set up some ground rules and teach my kids, when you eat, you need to sit down and eat. And then when you play, you can run around and play, but don't mix the two together. That's something I can do. I could as a parent, I could establish that rule. But if I ask myself, is this worry, is this train of thought leading me to an action? And if the answer to that is no, then chances are you are chasing after fool's gold and you are worrying about something that's not in your control. So how you can differentiate.
Yeah, that's good. When you were saying that, I was thinking of fear, right? Like there are times when fear is a good thing. Fear is a good, when you're standing over a cliff wondering, how much closer should I get? Can I get a little closer, and all of a sudden you feel fear. That's a protective emotion. It's when you look at a busy street and you're thinking, should I try to run across this busy street? I'm kind of afraid to try. Well, it's a mechanism that's protecting you. And then there's fear that is really harmful. And it sometimes fear protects you, and then there's a fear that prevents you from doing what you could do or should do. And I think worry and anxiety can be the same thing, right? There are times when worry is appropriate. You wake up in the middle of the night and your teenage son who has a 11 o'clock curfew isn't home and you fell asleep and now it's 3 a.m. Should you be worried for a minute? Yeah, you should. As long as it drives you to do something about it, right? That initial, oh my gosh, my son's not home. That's worry, but you don't want to live there, right? And anxiety sometimes, and I, again, I'm not a clinician, but how I think about it is worry should almost be like, of course you're going to worry for a minute, and then if you're living there, it becomes anxiety.
Right.
Like anxiety is more of a permanent state of worry, and it's different, but they kind of hold hands. And that's where it gets really tough. Is
Absolutely.
am I living here or am I visiting? Because visiting might drive me to action. It might cause me to recognize something that's unsafe or unhealthy or out of whack, and I can deal with it. Usually when you live there, not always, but oftentimes when you live there, it's because you haven't been able to pull yourself out of that loop to really evaluate and make some changes to address the situation that's causing you the worry and the anxiety. Because we, paralyzed by fear, we get paralyzed by worry and paralyzed by anxiety, paralyzed by depression. There's so many things that we experience that are in essence paralyzing. And when we get to that state, it is really hard to pull up out of that and kind of take a 30,000 foot view and say, okay, how can I fix some of this stuff to relieve the worry, the anxiety, the fear, the stress?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's so true what you were saying. We're not clinicians, but there are a lot of clinical support for what you said. I mean, we are wired, right? Like our amygdala, like our fight or flight mode and that's a good thing. We're wired to respond to emergencies, to have that heightened worry that then leads us to action, to fight or to flight.
Yeah.
But if you stay there, which is what I feel it is so easy to do as parents, you're just constantly in that heightened state of stress. You can't think clearly because you're in that fight or flight mode, and it can be crippling. Like the parent who wrote and said, where if you're just living in that heightened state, you are spinning your wheels, you're stuck, and it's must be so exhausting, and it can be so tiring.
That's good. One of the things I love about Scripture is it addresses everything. And it addresses a lot of stuff very specifically. And then if it doesn't address it specifically, it addresses other things that kind of fall in the same category. So there's principles, and then there's very specific things. And one of the things that Scripture addresses very specifically is worry. And again, I'm not a clinician. I'm not even a theologian. I'm a pastor, but I'm not a theologian. I wonder if the idea of anxiety and that word didn't exist way back in the day. Because if it did, I think in this case, I think these might be transferable, worry and anxiety. But the Bible does say, again, paraphrase, there's a verse in the Bible that says, does worry ever add a day to your life? Does worry add a day to your life? And no. Worrying about something does not fix it. Worrying about something does not add an extra day to your life. There's nothing beneficial about the state of worry. And it's just a good reminder that, man, as tough as it is, when we can, and again, anxiety, there's some roots to anxiety. There, you can't always just willpower your way out of
Right.
anxiety. That's why if you really are in a loop of anxiety or a state of anxiety versus, I have a tendency to worry sometimes. Those are two different things. And if you find yourself in a state of anxiety, you do need to go and talk to somebody who's trained, who can help you navigate that, and really figure out what are some of the root causes and what are some tools that they can give you to navigate and equip yourself to.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Grace, what would you say to the listener who's out there saying, like with your situation in particular, that, man, as a parent, that's probably what makes me nervous, is that I should have been prepared for a situation like that. And maybe I'm not going to be prepared for the next one. Either I should have kept my eye on them more than I did. I was, it kind of made me think of when back in the day I was a youth pastor and we did a car wash as a fundraiser. And I'd have my kids out there helping. And when my youngest, Macy Joy, was little, she was helping. She's really tiny, and she would do the tires, right, on the cars and stuff. And I sidetracked, watching other cars, and I heard someone scream, "Stop!" And I looked. This Jeep was backing up, and Macy Joy was behind the tire, and it had run over half her leg.
Oh, no.
Almost, if he didn't stop, he would have ran over her entire body and dead. And man, I'm starting to get choked up right now just thinking about it. But I just felt so bad afterwards, like a failure as a dad. Like that's my number one thing. I need to protect her. So, but if you have a number of these situations which happen because we're parents, and
Right.
we know that we're going to make mistakes, and it makes us feel like all that stress of parenting, right? So what would you say to the parent that's feeling that kind of anxiety of just either I'm not good enough or I've messed up so many times, and kind of living in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's something that we can all relate to and we've talked about this on this podcast before too, but when we feel like we fail, we feel like a failure. And I think, Kurt was saying this last time, there are going to be times where we probably look back and think we could have done something different. We could have done something better. But I think the hard part is when we absorb that into our identity and feel that we ourselves are failures, it can then spiral us down to not doing anything more productive after that. Because if you feel like you're a failure, then why try? Why try to do better? Basically, there's no hope. If you're a failure and you messed up and that means you're a failure, then why should you even try? But the reality is you yourself are not a failure. Accidents happen. There are things we can learn from it. But, we are continuing to try in our journey. And if you try, then you're not a failure, and you can kind of pull yourself up, surround yourself with people that will encourage you, help you see that your
key.
mistake
That's so
is
good.
not your identity. And what I'll say, linked to what we're talking about today, is that those situations like Kara's choking, like an accident of, a car running over your child's leg, that can really drive us to this anxiety, right? And getting into that loop, because we then want that control. We want to believe the lie that as a parent, we should be like God, that we should be able to control everything, that we should foresee everything, that we should be able to monitor everything. And it almost feels like it's a good thing to want that. And that's why I think this is such an easy loop trap to get into. But that's what I meant but it's not reality. We're human, we're limited, and we're not God. We can never and will never be able to control everything. And so
that's good.
unless we can accept that, we'll be sort of sucked into this toxic loop of trying to control something that's beyond our control and drive ourselves crazy, even if that's coming from such a good place, a place of love. We're grasping for that thing that we can't have as humans because we're not God.
That's good.
It's a really good question. Kurt, did you want to say anything
Nope,
to that?
nope,
Or okay.
keep
All right.
going.
So my last step. So the first step, kind of break that cycle. Like, are you chasing after fool's gold? Step 2, find out what is in your ability to control versus not by asking the question, is this leading me to action? And if it is, do that action. And so my last step is, what do you do about those things then that you've identified as being out of your control? Because that doesn't feel great,
Right.
Like, what can you do in that case? And so in that situation, for the things that you've identified as just kind of spinning you into a loop, the thing that has helped me personally the most is practicing the power of now, which is really pulling your thoughts, pulling your just frame of mind into the present moment. And I'll give a work example. A few years back when I got a promotion and I had to do a lot more presentations, that first presentation or several after that, I was so anxious. And it was like, in 3 days, I have to give this presentation. Oh my gosh, am I going to be prepared? What questions are they going to ask me? And then 2 days. And so it was like the countdown. It was like 8 more hours. And I remember getting advice from someone is to just don't think about that moment. Just think about where you're at right now. Practice the power of now. And I really leaned into that, where it was like, Kurt, if you came up to me and you were like, hey Grace, how's it going? Like, how are you? A normal question. I would have to I would have to reel in my thoughts because I was just obsessed over that presentation.
Because your tendency would to say, I'm stressed out. I have to give a presentation in 2 days.
Yes, in 2 days. Or then if you ask me one day before, I have to give a presentation one day, 8 hours, but I have to give a presentation 8 hours.
Right.
But I had to, it was a discipline. I had to be like, right now, Kurt, thank you for that question. Oh, I feel warm. I'm breathing. I just ate lunch, so I'm satisfied. I mean, it's almost silly, but I had to be so tangible as to what's going on right now. The breeze right now just felt really nice. I had to center myself in where I'm at. And in that way, that's how I survived. Right now, in this moment, I'm okay.
Right.
And that's something I've tried to practice with my kids when my thoughts spiral to, what if they go to school and they start choking? And that whole very easy to get wrapped up in that trigger, that fear of choking. Even to this day, if kids cough, I'm like, who's choking? It's I jump up.
Sure.
Yeah. But what I have to remind myself, especially for things that are not in my control, is, right now, I can't control everything that might happen with my kids, but in this moment, we're together.
Right.
We're okay. We're laughing.
Right.
And let me stay in this place as opposed to being pulled to some place that hasn't happened yet and may not ever happen.
That's good. Well, we have these filters in our brains that filter out stuff that's not important to us. So that's why we can have a conversation while there's music in the background at a mall, right? Because our brain is filtering out the stuff that doesn't really matter. If that filter didn't, we'd go crazy because then everything matters. And that's why when you buy a new white car, all of a sudden you notice, wow, there's a lot of white Toyota Corollas because you just bought a Toyota Corolla. So all of a sudden white Toyota Corollas are of interest to you. So now you see them everywhere. When you have a child almost get run over by a car, when you have a child who was choking and could have been very seriously, the outcome could have been serious. Suddenly, kids getting hit by cars at car washes, choking, it wasn't really on your radar before. And now that you've experienced it, now it's important to you. So, and I'm not hearing, I didn't hear you say this, but I just want to reiterate, there's a difference between paying attention and being concerned about something and worrying and being anxious about it. Of course, you're forever marked by the fact that your daughter choked and it was very serious. Of course. That was a traumatic moment and you are now aware of that. Of course. And you learned, and it's probably okay to pay a little bit of extra attention to how much fruit you give her in one, right? Of course. You just can't let yourself get in the loop of being dominated and anxious about it, right? And there is a difference. as we wrap up, and we maybe should have led with this, but we'll end with this, and that's maybe just as good as I think it's okay to acknowledge raising kids is anxiety inducing. It's a big deal. And I think it's harder to raise kids today than it was when I was raising my kids. My teenagers, until they were really old enough for the most part to navigate it, didn't really have much. Social media wasn't really a thing. The world is crazier now than it was. The world is different. The smartphones, access to everything. I mean, there is here I go again with my studies that I cannot source. But there was a study, and it showed the level of teenage anxiety and depression, how it has increased since the smartphone got introduced. And it is just every year, high and to the right. It boom, 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 boom. From the moment that we put in our kids' hands the ability to look at Instagram, to look at Facebook, to go on Twitter, to go on TikTok, to compare themselves, to go all the things, that has just increased. And we as parents, of course, as the world has affected our kids, it's a more anxious time to be a child than it ever has been. It's a more anxious time automatically, therefore, to be a parent. So, because, like I said at the beginning, I didn't experience it that much, partly because it was an easier time. My kids are only in their 20s, so I'm only rolling the clock back 10 years, 15 years. The world was different 10, 15 years ago. It was not as anxious of a time to raise kids. And we just have to navigate to the best that we can the world in which we're raising our kids. And it is tougher to raise kids today than it ever has been. So, man or woman, Mr. or Mrs., mom or dad, whoever asked that question, we're praying for you because being a parent is no easy task.
That's right.
And it does induce anxiety, but the Bible says that God gives peace to those who ask and wisdom to those who ask. And when we lean into that, doesn't automatically erase all the challenges, doesn't erase our worry instantly. It helps. It helps. Asking God for his peace that he promises and his wisdom that he promises as we navigate raising our kids. And we'll close by saying, if you are a parent who you would identify as, you know what, it's not just I worry here or there, but I really do have anxiety and anxious. I live there. We would encourage you to go get some help. My hunch would say that struggle shows up in other areas in your life other than just your parenting. It probably shows up in a lot of your areas of your life. And so you want to make sure that you're getting the help and the support and the encouragement and the tools that you need to navigate all that. So, yeah. All righty. Hey, thank you so much for joining us. Grace, well done. Chris,
Thank you.
Do not hit any of that weird music on the way
No
out.
outro
There's
music.
no outro. We'll see you guys next time. Oh, no. Hey, we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for joining the On Purpose Parents podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can help us by rating and reviewing our podcast on iTunes. If you're listening on our Saddleback Parents YouTube channel, please like and leave a comment. Also, remember to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends. You can connect with us by texting the word parents to the number 83000, following us on Instagram at Saddleback Parents, and emailing your comments to parents@saddleback.com. As a huge thank you, you can browse our hundreds of free resources at onpurposeparents.com, all created to help you win at parenting. We'll catch you next time.